The city of Jerusalem was drowning in corruption. Violence filled the streets. Wicked men grew richer while the innocent suffered. The people of God had turned away from him, chasing after their own desires. In the midst of this chaos stood a man, Habakkuk. Unlike the other prophets, he did not bring a message to the people. Instead, he had a question, a burden too heavy to carry alone. One night, with tears in his eyes, Habakkuk fell to his knees. His voice trembled as he cried out, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? The wicked surround the righteous, and justice is perverted." His voice echoed into the night, but there was no answer, only silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, still no response from God. Habakkuk watched as injustice spread like wildfire. The powerful crushed the weak. The leaders were corrupt. The people ignored God's commands. Each morning Habakkuk prayed. Each night he waited, but heaven remained silent. Then one day something happened. As Habakkuk sat outside the city staring at the horizon, a voice broke through the silence, a voice powerful yet calm. "Look at the nations and be amazed, for I am doing something in your days, something you wouldn't believe even if you were told." Habakkuk's heart raced. Finally God had answered, but the next words shook him to the core. "I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and swift nation. They will march across the land and conquer everything in their path." Habakkuk's face turned pale. The Babylonians? The most feared empire of their time? They were more wicked than Judah. With trembling lips he asked, "But Lord, how can you use them? They are cruel and arrogant. Will you let them destroy us completely?" God did not explain. He did not defend his plan. He only left Habakkuk with a choice, to trust him or to doubt. Habakkuk was torn. He had begged God for justice, but this was not the answer he expected. How could a good God allow such suffering? Why was he using the wicked to punish his own people? His heart burned with confusion, but deep down he knew one thing: God's ways were higher than his own. And so, with uncertainty still in his heart, Habakkuk climbed a watchtower. He stood there looking out at the horizon. The world seemed dark and God's plan unclear. Yet, he whispered to himself, "I will stand at my watch and wait to see what he will say to me." Little did he know, God was about to reveal something far greater than he could imagine. Habakkuk stood on the watchtower, his eyes scanning the horizon. The air was thick with uncertainty. He had poured out his heart to God, asking for justice, pleading for answers, but what he received was even more troubling. God was sending the Babylonians. As the wind howled around him, Habakkuk whispered, "Lord, I will wait. I will stand here until you speak again." Hours turned into days. The city below continued in its wickedness. Merchants cheated the poor. Judges took bribes. Leaders lived in luxury while the people suffered. The cries of the oppressed echoed in the streets, and yet God remained silent. Habakkuk clenched his fists. "Why, Lord? Why must the righteous suffer while the wicked prosper?" Then, at last, the voice of God returned. "Write down the vision," the Lord commanded. "Make it plain on tablets so that whoever reads it may run with it." Habakkuk grabbed a tablet and chisel, his hands shaking. "The vision awaits its appointed time. Though it lingers, wait for it. It will surely come and will not delay. The righteous will live by faith." Habakkuk's breath caught. Live by faith? That was the answer? Not an army? Not immediate justice? God continued, his voice unwavering. "Indeed, the Babylonians are puffed up with pride. Their strength is their God, but their time will come. Woe to them who build cities with bloodshed. Woe to those who steal and oppress. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of my glory as the waters cover the sea." A shiver ran down Habakkuk's spine. God was not ignoring injustice. He was setting a plan in motion, one far beyond what Habakkuk could see. Still, questions burned within him. "Lord, I hear you," Habakkuk said softly, "but I do not understand. How can I trust when everything around me is falling apart?" That night, as Habakkuk lay in his bed, a distant rumble shook the ground. The stars above flickered, as if the heavens themselves trembled. Something was coming. The Babylonians. Habakkuk bolted upright, heart pounding. Was this the beginning of the destruction God had spoken about? Had the time arrived? He rushed to the city walls, where watchmen peered into the distance. A faint dust cloud rose on the horizon, small but growing. They are coming. Fear threatened to grip his heart. The wicked would be punished, yes, but at what cost? Would any of God's people survive? And in the silence, one question remained unanswered in his heart. Can I still trust God, even when everything seems lost? The dust cloud on the horizon thickened. The earth trembled beneath Habakkuk's feet as the Babylonians marched closer. The city's watchmen whispered among themselves, their faces pale with fear. "They are coming," one of them muttered. Habakkuk swallowed hard. This was the moment he had feared. The ruthless, unstoppable force of Babylon was drawing near, just as God had said. But why? Why would God allow such devastation? His thoughts swirled as he left the city walls and made his way back to the temple. His heart burned with both fear and faith, doubt and trust. As he stepped into the temple, God's voice returned, firm, unshaken, like thunder rolling over the mountains. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods and makes himself wealthy by extortion. Habakkuk flinched. He had seen it with his own eyes, merchants cheating the poor, rulers hoarding riches. Woe to him who builds his house by unjust gain, setting his nest on high to escape ruin. The corrupt leaders, securing their wealth while the people suffered. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by crime. The oppressors, those who shed innocent blood for their own gain. Woe to him who gives drink to his neighbors, making them drunk so he can gaze upon their nakedness. The deceitful, those who used others for their own pleasure. Woe to him who says to wood, "Come to life," or to stone, "Wake up." Can it give guidance? The idol worshippers, the ones who had abandoned the living God for lifeless statues. Habakkuk's hands trembled as he listened. The Lord was not blind to the sins of the people. He was not ignorant of their wickedness, and he would act. Then the voice of the Lord declared, "The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." A deep silence filled the temple. Habakkuk's heart pounded. Babylon would rise, but it would also fall. The wicked would have their moment, but it would not last. God's justice was not slow. It was precise. It was coming at the appointed time, and in the end, only one kingdom would remain. Habakkuk fell to his knees. The storm of emotions inside him, anger, fear, doubt, began to settle. The world around him was shaking, but God was not. Suddenly shouts echoed through the streets. Habakkuk ran to the city gates. The dust cloud had drawn closer. The Babylonians were near. The people of Judah panicked. Some grabbed their weapons. Others gathered their families hiding inside their homes. Habakkuk clenched his fists. He had asked God for justice, and now judgment was at the doorstep. And yet, deep in his heart something stirred, a faith that refused to be shaken. "The righteous will live by faith," he whispered, repeating the words God had spoken. The world around him was falling apart, but somehow, he knew God was still in control. The sound of hoofbeats thundered through the valley. The Babylonians had arrived. The first war horns pierced the air. Habakkuk watched from the city walls as a sea of Babylonian warriors flooded the valley, their banners flapping in the wind like the wings of vultures. The gates of Jerusalem groaned as guards rushed to reinforce them. Women clutched their children, whispering desperate prayers. The streets filled with frantic footsteps, people scattering like sheep before a storm. Habakkuk's heart pounded. This is it, the judgment God spoke of. The Babylonians were relentless. They did not negotiate. They did not spare the weak. They had crushed mighty nations before, and now Judah stood in their path. Habakkuk turned his eyes to the sky. "Lord, you said the wicked would not last, but how long must we endure this?" No answer came, only the sound of war drums. With a mighty crash, the first strike against the city gates sent a tremor through Jerusalem. Babylonian rams slammed against the wood, the force shaking the very ground beneath Habakkuk's feet. Screams rose from the streets. Soldiers grabbed their weapons, but deep inside everyone knew their strength was no match for Babylon. Habakkuk gritted his teeth. "Where are you, Lord? Did you not promise that the wicked would fall?" And then, in the midst of chaos, God's voice returned. "Though it lingers, wait for it. It will surely come." Habakkuk inhaled sharply. The destruction was real. The suffering was overwhelming, but God's promise had not changed. As the city burned, as Babylonian warriors stormed through the streets, a choice lay before Habakkuk. Would he trust in what he saw or in what God had spoken? The Lord had warned him. The Lord had prepared him. Now, standing amidst ruin, Habakkuk whispered, "The righteous will live by faith." Faith, not in circumstances. Faith, not in human strength. Faith, even when God seemed silent. The enemy raged. The city crumbled. But Habakkuk's heart held firm because he knew this was not the end of the story. Smoke curled into the sky as fire devoured the homes of Jerusalem. The once bustling streets were now filled with the cries of the wounded and the clash of swords. The Babylonians showed no mercy. Habakkuk moved through the chaos, his heart breaking at the sight of his people suffering. He saw an elderly man fall to his knees, clutching his chest as soldiers stormed past him. A mother huddled in a corner, shielding her child with trembling hands. This was the judgment of God. Yet, even in the destruction, a question burned within Habakkuk's soul. Would God still deliver his people? Would justice truly come for the Babylonians, as he had promised? He wanted to believe, but believing was hard when everything around him was falling apart. A group of survivors, priests, farmers, and children gathered near the ruins of the temple, their faces streaked with ash and tears. They looked to Habakkuk, their eyes pleading for answers. "What do we do?" one man asked. "Has the Lord abandoned us?" cried another. Habakkuk took a deep breath. He had asked the same question. He had wrestled with doubt, and yet the answer was clear. "The Lord has not abandoned us," he said, though his voice trembled. "Though the fig tree does not bud, though there are no grapes on the vine, though the fields produce no food, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." The people stared at him. The city was burning. The enemy was victorious. But here stood Habakkuk, choosing to trust in God's promise. Faith was not about what they saw. It was about who God is. Some nodded, their faces softening with understanding. Others still struggled, their eyes filled with fear. But one thing was certain. Those who remained had a choice. Would they live in fear, or would they hold on to faith? Meanwhile, within the city, Babylon's generals gathered, their laughter echoing through the broken streets. They feasted in the palace of Judah's kings, drinking from stolen goblets, boasting of their power. To them, Judah was just another conquered nation, another step in their rise to greatness. They did not know that their time was coming. Even as they celebrated, God's judgment was already set in motion. Habakkuk stood on the smoldering walls of the city, looking out at the vast army that had overtaken them. Yes, the present was dark. Yes, suffering had come. But deep in his heart, a truth settled. This was not the end. God had spoken. Babylon would not rule forever. His justice would come at the appointed time. And so, as the world around him burned, Habakkuk lifted his hands to the heavens and whispered once more, "The sovereign Lord is my strength." Days turned into weeks. The once proud city of Jerusalem lay in ruins. Smoke still lingered in the air, and the echoes of suffering had not yet faded. The Babylonians ruled with an iron fist, their soldiers patrolling the streets, their governors seated on the thrones once occupied by Judah's kings. But even in the midst of defeat, a small remnant of God's people remained, those who had not given up hope. And among them stood Habakkuk. One evening, as Habakkuk walked among the ruins of the temple, he remembered the vision God had given him. The 5 woes against Babylon, the promise that the righteous would live by faith, and the certainty that the wicked would not endure forever. He had doubted, he had struggled. But now, in the silence of destruction, he understood. God was never blind to injustice. His timing was not like man's, and though Babylon was strong now, its fall was certain. Years later, long after Habakkuk was gone, his prophecy came to pass. The mighty Babylon, the nation that had seemed invincible, was brought down by the Persians. Their pride had become their downfall, their greed, their destruction, just as God had said. Before his time on earth ended, Habakkuk wrote one final prayer, a song, a declaration of faith even in the face of suffering. "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Renew them in our day. In our time make them known. In wrath, remember mercy." He reflected on God's power, the way he had rescued his people in the past, the way he had parted the seas and shaken the mountains. And then, with full confidence in God's justice and mercy, he declared, "Though the fig tree does not bud and there are no grapes on the vine, though the olive crop fails and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. The sovereign Lord is my strength." The story of Habakkuk teaches us that faith is not about what we see, it's about who God is. There will be times when God seems silent. There will be moments when injustice appears to win. There will be seasons where we don't understand what God is doing, but even then, God is still in control. His timing is perfect. His justice will come. And no matter how dark the present seems, his promises will never fail. Like Habakkuk, we must choose to say, even if everything falls apart, I will still trust in God. And that is the faith that will carry us through the storms of life.